So hello everyone, thanks for inviting me. I'm Vasily Korovkin from Universitat Pompeu Fabra, and this is joint work with Alexei Makarin and Yuhei Miyachi. And back to conflict, right? So I'm going to talk about supply chain disruptions and war. All right, so it's actually really easy to motivate this paper in this audience. Overall, I'm going to start with this sort of a broad motivation, which is we do know that conflicts and wars, they have a very large aggregate negative effects. However, what is also true is that battlegrounds and conflict events, they are often restricted in space, right? So they're often tied to ethnic borders or perhaps international borders or ethnic boundaries, all right? Now, while at the same time, we do observe these large aggregate effects, and so perhaps it does suggest that there are economy-wide effects beyond destruction of physical and human capital locally, all right? So in these places, and this relates to a little bit to the papers that we've seen yesterday as well. Now, what we're gonna see, so what I'm gonna show you in this paper, that we're gonna focus on different types of destruction rather than human or physical capital. So specifically, we're going to focus on disruption of supply chain or supply chain linkages, and there are going to be two main results in the paper. All right. So the first result is essentially that there is a transmission of those negative shocks, so transmission of those localized negative shocks through essentially cost and demand shocks. They transmit throughout the economy. All right. So this is the first main result of the paper, and then I'm going to follow up with showing you how firms reorganize their production networks. So they restructure their production network in response to those shocks, and there could be essentially substitution or scaling down. So this is what firms face, and then and this is the last one. I'm also going to show you sort of two different channels that are happening there in our model. All right. So why there is limited work on that? So far there's not too much data on firm or production network during war times, and specifically in those areas that are highly affected. And there is also, so this is part of our contribution data-wise, and then on top of it, usually we can think about a conflict being endogenous in some way. So we have a localized shock that is going to be, in some sense, exogenous compared to the production network in the rest of the country, or sort of in those non-conflict areas that I hinted to. All right. So let me be more specific. So the results I'm going to show you are from 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine, where Russia suddenly annexed Crimea and occupied part of the east of the country, right? So part of Donbas area. Now the context and the conflict back then was highly localized, right? So it's not like 2022 invasion where essentially all of Ukraine is affected. So it's localized to two particular regions of the country. And in addition to this, we use the universe of firm-to-firm transaction data, right? So we have a localized conflict, and we use firm-to-firm transaction from railway shipments to map what is sort of the production network structure in the economy back then, right? And we're going to have, I'm going to show you the results from 5 years of data. Sometimes I'm going to split it on the pre and post period. So it's from 2012 to 2016. All right? So the way the paper is structured is that at first I'm going to show you the reduced form evidence on sort of what are the impact of if I'm in a firm that is exposed to conflict indirectly, so either through supplier or buyer linkages. So what's going to happen to me, all right? And I'm going to focus only on firms in non-conflict areas for the most of those results, all right? So what is happening if I'm exposed, if my supplier or buyer is shocked by the conflict, all right? So that's essentially the first question. And in which sense am I affected? So I'm going to show you some results on firm sales and essentially firm output, and then on what is happening to my linkages outside of the conflict areas, right? So what is happening to my supplier and buyer linkages for sort of if I'm a firm that is not in the conflict area, all right? And then the second part of the paper, and that's where we have a methodological contribution as well, is a general equilibrium model, which we bring to the data, all right? So this model features endogenous production network formation. So we're going to leverage this model to essentially understand what is the aggregate welfare effect, right? So if you think about the reduced form evidence and the diff and diff, you can think that, you know, there could be spillover effects, there could be some stable unit treatment value assumption is violated. So essentially, all of these type of effects we're going to try to address in the general equilibrium model as well, right? I mean, we do some robustness checks also, actually do a lot of robustness checks, but I'm probably not going to show you in the reduced form part as well. All right. So what's the main finding, right? So what's if some of you have to leave to the airport, that's the slide that I want you to remember. Now, what is the main finding? So first of all, there's a 16% decrease in the output of the firms. That's for the firms who are, again, I want to repeat this, that are not in the conflict areas, all right? But they do have as either a buyer or supplier exposure to firms that were directly affected. All right? And here in the first part of the results, I'm going to pull supplier and buyer exposure. All right? In the second part of the result, I'm going to show you the reorganization of production linkages away from directly and indirectly exposed firms. All right? And this is where I'm going to sort of decompose the effect of supplier exposure and the effect of buyer exposure. So what's happening to the firm if I'm a firm far away from Donbass? So what's going to happen to me if I'm affected? So if I had a supplier that was affected, what I'm going to do, I'm going to substitute to what are the firms that are in the non-conflict areas. So I'm going to find new suppliers in the non-conflict areas, but I'm going to scale down at the same time. So there are two effects that are driven by this supplier exposure. Now, if I'm exposed, so if I have a demand shock, so if I have a buyer exposure to conflict, what I'm going to do, I'm going to scale down, and I'm also going to not only scale down in terms of how I sell, but also I'm going to scale down in terms of how supply, right? So I'm going to also scale down in terms of the number of suppliers, all right? So this is the main reduced form findings, and then we bring this to the model. And essentially, in the model, there are essentially two main effects. So the first part, the first thing that I'm going to show you is that if we use this sufficient statistics in the model, what we're going to see is that firm level output loss is amplified from the endogenous network. So if I'm a firm that is already affected, so what's going to happen from this endogenous network effect is that I'm actually going to be hit even further. Right? So this is a little bit in the spirit of this higher order effects and is in line with the reduced form evidence. Now, however, if we aggregate, so if we calculate the aggregate welfare effect in the whole economy, what's going to happen that there is also going to be a mitigation effect. So the production networks will readjust, right? So the firms that were already affected, they kind of hit stronger implicitly by this this endogenous network channel, but overall the networks are mitigated. I'm going to show you. So there is a 5.6 aggregate welfare loss in the areas outside of the conflict zone compared to the actual 11 or 12% GRP losses in this region. So if we combine it, so our model explained quite a lot of actual variation, actual decline outside of the conflict areas. However, I'm also going to show you what is the number if I close this mitigation channel in the model. All right. So if I do not allow firms to readjust their network. So this is essentially two main reduced form results and two main model-based results. All right, so let me give you more details now. So first of all, the background and data. In 2013, Maidan revolution happened in Ukraine, and in 2014, shortly after, Russia invaded Crimea and essentially started supporting separatists in the east. So this is a very well-known fact by now. Now, what happened back then, before 2022, is that fighting was ongoing, but it was highly localized to one particular region in the country, all right? And by 2019, it also calmed down for a while. Now, and this was sudden and intense, all right? Also, what is an important fact here to understand the sort of the institutional framework, and then Donbass and Crimea, they were important for the Ukrainian economy before the war. Now, Donbass was perhaps more important in terms of the industry, so they had coal and metallurgy and manufacturing, also some chemical plants. Crimea was more focused on agriculture and tourism, all right? Overall, combined, if we take 2013 data, those three regions were roughly 18% of Ukrainian GDP. Now, what I'm going to leverage for most of the analysis is the firm-to-firm railway shipment data for 5 years, which has 100 million transactions between 8,500 firms, all right? So what are the main variables there? Essentially a sender and receiver ID, which allows us to map this data sort of to firms. Then the days of transactions, the weights, the freight charges, and the product costs, which are really important in what follows. And then the origin and destination station codes. So we can actually do two types of exercises. Either we can focus on firms, which we mostly do, or we can try to focus on sort of firm station pairs. So if we can think about multi-plant firms. All right, so we focus on inter-firm trade, which is 94% of the transactions. And then the values, so how do we get the values from this data? We have very, very granular product codes. So we can actually calculate values based on weight and the customs data or other types of essentially data where you have a value and the weight and the product code. So we have like 10-digit product codes. So we impute for some of these exercises that I'm going to show you, essentially the value on a very, very granular level. And the links between firms were observed directly from the data. Now, the fact that we do focus, so I got those questions in the past, the fact that we do focus only on the railway shipments is unlikely to bias our results. So first of all, they cover roughly 80% in terms of freight in ton kilometers. So it's a very, very actually large share of domestic transactions that are shipped via railways. There were no systematic disruption in the rest of the country apart from Donbass itself. So outside of the conflict areas. And what we implicitly assume, we can also do some robustness exercises, is that the changes in whatever the mode of transportation is used, which is the two, railways or roads, regular roads, it's essentially orthogonal to the conflict exposure itself, right? So that's what we essentially have to rely in some parts of the reduced form analysis, and which from the context is a fairly plausible assumption actually, because yeah, there's not too much destruction outside of there's virtually no destruction outside of the conflict areas. All right, and then we link this data to the data that is a sort of a common source of the data, Orbis Amadeus or Spark Interfax, which is essentially official statistics of Ukrainian statistical service that then they share with those companies, and they also provide some cleaning to it. So we have also a few years of the data for Ukrainian firms. All right, and that's just to visualize what's going on there. So we have the black areas, they're essentially occupied. The dark gray areas are parts of the two eastern provinces that are, well, they're parts of the same provinces, but are not occupied. They're controlled by the central government. And then the white areas are what we mostly focused on in the rest of the paper. And the pink dots are the stations, right? So you can think about firms that are sort of living somewhere around those or in those pink stations. All right. So the first thing that I want to document is that the trade indeed is disrupted in our data, right? So how do we do it? I essentially take the fraction of suppliers and buyers that ship from and to conflict areas and sort of to firms outside of direct conflict areas, right? So this is essentially documenting how the shares of shipments were before the conflict in 2012 and 2013, and then what's happened to them in 2014 and then later in 2015, 2016. And we see that, you know, this sort of the shares of in and out shipments, they were roughly around 0.5 at the beginning, and then they declined to 0. So this is for the upper part, and then if we take the median, we're gonna actually have slightly smaller shares, but we basically they decline. So essentially for the firms that were trading, which were in the upper part of the distribution of shares, for all of them, the change was that those shares, they dropped to 0, right? So the median firm, they maybe were not trading that much with Donbass, but anyone in sort of the right half of the distribution, whoever were trading, no matter what the percentile, it goes down to 0. Right? So this is basically sort of a first stage or like more like a common sense check to document that indeed trade is deteriorating domestically with the conflict areas. All right? Okay, so now the more interesting results is looking directly on the sales. So I'm gonna first, so this is the way I write the regressions. So there is a firm that is outside the conflict areas, and then the T is a year. We can of course do some more granular time analysis. Now YFT here is just sales, and then the second regression that I'm going to show you are the linkages. And then I can also look at the buyers and suppliers linkages. Now, how do I calculate the supplier-buyer exposure that I mentioned early on? Well, I will essentially take the value share of shipment from conflict areas compared to the old shipments in 2012 and 2013. So pre-conflict, and then the buyer is essentially symmetric shipments to conflict areas. Yeah. So so this is sort of the main regression that I'm going to run. Before that, what I'm going to establish is that overall there is a deterioration of sales. So before sort of looking on sort of the differential exposure, I'm just going to say, okay, if I was trading with conflict area, what's happening to my sales? And in the event study, we can see that essentially, if I just define the conflict as, you know, the conflict exposures just being having a dummy 0,1 to being exposed, and then I have a two-way fixed effect. What's happening there is that essentially my sales deteriorate, and there are no pre-trends, so that's good news. And this number, if we combine it in one estimate, is roughly 16%, as I said. All right. So this is the log sales. Now, what is also happening? There is some extensive margin change. So we do see firms that they stop reporting their sales data in our data, and this goes up by 7%. So that's a sort of an extensive margin outcome. Now, if I want to go deeper and sort of decompose this into what's happening if I am exposed, if my supplier is affected or if my buyer is affected, there is some differences in the coefficients. But in any case, in both cases, I have a strong negative and significant effects, and the same is true for extensive margins. So if I am exposed to buyers or to suppliers shock, I do have both negative intensive margin and extensive margin response. And then I can play around sort of with the definition of what is the exposure. Is it the continuous variable, or if it's the dummy for high exposure, let's say above 75%. All right, so this is essentially the first finding. Now what I want to do, I want to dig deeper and understand what are sort of the mechanisms that are driving those results and what is happening to the rest of my production network. All right, so if I'm this non-conflict firm, what is going to happen to me? So here I'm going to focus on on higher supplier and higher buyer exposure. So this is the dummies. But ultimately, what I want to do is I want to first document what is the effect of the supplier shock on my supplier and buyer linkages, right? So this is essentially those two event studies where I measure what is the number of suppliers that I have in non-conflict areas, being in the non-conflict areas myself. And if I have a supplier shock, well, what is happening? The first thing that is happening is that actually increase the number of suppliers outside the conflict area. So this is this reallocation or readjustment effect. And then I do scale down the number of buyers. So overall, I do have less connections because I'm hit by this supplier shock. So I'm trying to compensate for my supplier shock, but inevitably I have to essentially reduce the scale of my production. And if I have purely a demand shock, so if I have a buyer exposure, then I scale down both. So I decrease the number of suppliers outside of the conflict zone, and I do decrease the number of buyers as well. All right? So this is the reduced form findings. So now we know more or less what's going on with the firms. I want to bring this to the model, and I also want to estimate those effects, the aggregate effects, and I also want to understand what's going on and how we should think about those results in one conceptual framework. All right, so I'm going to show you the results where I have regions. You can think about provinces. That's our main specification. We can decompose it into districts, but this is easier for sort of computational purposes. I have a measure of households that supply a unit of labor at a competitive wage, WI, in a given region. And then there are going to be firm types, all right? So what is the firm types here? How do we map this into the data? So firm types, you can see, you can think about essentially 4 firm types. So there are going to be firm types that have a very low exposure, or I have low exposure both to supplier and buyer shock, or I have a higher supplier and low buyer shock, high buyer and low supplier shock, or high level of both shocks. So there are going to be, in reality, the way I'm going to do it in the data is going to be 4 types of firms, depending on their supplier and buyer exposure. All right, or prior connection to the conflict. Now, the firms can trade in the model as long as they're connected. So there's going to be something about modeling this endogenous network parts, so how those connections are formed. I'm going to show you in 2 slides. And then within these types, so within the omega, firms are identical. This is also something that we can get as a result in the model. So in other words, the measures of linkages, they're going to summarize the network architecture. And otherwise, other than that, it's going to be the rest of the model is going to be standard in the sense that we're going to have a standard iceberg transportation costs, CES and Cobb-Douglas, CES demand and Cobb-Douglas CES production function. For the purposes of the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you just one sector model. In reality, we have 3, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what are the 3 sectors when I show you the empiricals part. All right, so firms produce according to the following technology, where the Cobb-Douglas technology, where you have the labor input, then some productivity shock, and then you have the intermediate inputs. All right. So the intermediate inputs, they ship from other firms, where M is essentially the measure of my connections to other firms, and then Q is essentially how much I ship from them. So this M is a measure of supply linkages, and then, as I said, so there are types, there are firm types which are indexed by omega or nu. And then there are locations, U and I. So I'm going to endogenize this in the next slide. And then, so the supplier linkages, the reason why I want to ship from more than one firm is essentially that I have a lot of variety effect here in the CES. And then there is a constant markup so in this model. Now, what I'm going to end up having, so this is a relatively standard gravity, is that I'm going to have the trade flows. So those are the axes, UI. and then this is a non-standard, so this is my measure of connection, so this is different from the standard gravity. And then I have the iceberg costs, the sort of the marginal cost of supplying stuff, and then the demand exposure. All right. So I need to estimate this gravity somehow, and then that's what I'm going to do in a second. And then I also want to map this into what's happening, some welfare measure for the firms. So what is the welfare measure in this model? It's going to be a revenue for the firm. So it's going to be the intermediate goods sales by firm omega, and then I'm going to aggregate this to get the welfare effect in the sort of the next exercise. But first, let me show you this. So this is essentially the sufficient statistic where I map. So it's a mapping between the R, the firm sales, some productivity shock, the wages, and then those are the two key variables which are essentially, they're determined in equilibrium, but I'm going to estimate them for each firm from the gravity model. Those are the supplier excess and the buyer excess. So those are essentially the structural equivalent of those supplier and buyer variables from the reduced form. And they're essentially, the supplier excess is some weighted measure of transportation costs and the marginal costs. And the buyer excess is essentially some weighted combination of transportation costs and the demand shock. So this actually can, well, no, before that, what is happening, how M is determined. So what we assume, and this is, I'm going to speak a little bit about the micro foundation, but we assume that M is determined as some exogenous factor in equilibrium times the trade flows and then some costs of link formation, all right? And so the costs of link formation, they are paid in a salary, in the combination of salary and sort of intermediate input costs. In reality, when we do not only calibrate, but we try to estimate this mu, we get mu close to 1. So it's mostly paid in the salaries. Now this structure can be microfitted by several classes of trade models, either the ones with search and matching frictions or some entry costs that are market-specific entry costs, all right? There are also some other types of models where we can microfind a function that's going to be discrete equivalent of this. Now, so the households, the final good, the households with Cobb-Douglas and CES preferences, they purchase final goods from those firms. And then, of course, so what we're going to need is just market clearing condition for all of those, for labor, intermediate goods, and final goods market. All right. Yes?
Just a clarification. So this is building the link, or is it maintaining the link also? In the model, if you re-estimate, are you re-estimating this every year?
So this is creating the link. So the way we think about it is that I'm going to essentially recalculate different sort of M's depending on the counterfactual that I want, right? So we do this once in the model, and then we can sort of distort this somehow later on based on the sort of the assumptions from the data. Let me not the assumptions, but based on what we sort of want to measure. So you can think about keeping this network as it is in 2013, or allowing it to readjust and using it from, let's say, 2016. So those type of exercises. All right. So let me actually give you more details on that. But first, let me sort of tell you what are sort of the types, the regions, and then. So they're going to be 25 provinces. So we aggregated a little bit, and 3 conflict areas, which are the 3 occupied areas. Now 3 sectors that are mining, manufacturing, and other types, and 4 types of firms depending on how exposed they are by a supplier or buyer linkages, as I said. Now we basically take the trade flows and the linkages from railway data, again, that's in the reduced form part, and we calibrate some of the parameters that I show you. So the labor, so the Cobb-Douglas elasticities, and then the CES elasticity we take from IO tables and from existing literature, or we can also take the profit to revenue ratio. And then this is something that we estimate, but it's basically tied to the reduced form part, right? So we can tie lambdas to the reduced form part. We can actually play around with this a little bit, so we can do lambdas that is, as long as it's, so we prefer the specification where lambda sums up to 0.3, but it could be 0 and 0.3 or 0.3 and 0. The results do not change that much. All right. Now, what does the model? So there are two parts of this analysis. As I said, the first one is going to be to sort of corroborate the model to try to see how good the fit is, and this will also tell us something about the amplification effects. And the second part will be to do sort of the aggregate counterfactual. Okay, so the model implies, as I already said, this sufficient statistic formula, which is a combination of two parts. So the first part is some weighted, so wages and the supplier and buyer access variables, so essentially those measures of linkages. And the second part is an observed productivity shock. So the way I'm going to test the model fit is I'm going to try to calculate, well, this number is observed from the revenues, and I'm going to try to estimate those numbers, and then see if this coefficient is indeed equal to 1. So basically, if the model, sort of the left-hand side and the right-hand side, they match. All right? Now, for this, I need to have this alpha S and alpha B, which I do not observe. I need to estimate those, and I estimate those from the gravity models. From a gravity model, via essentially decomposing those parts into fixed effects. And the second component is that I do have this unobserved productivity shock, log Z, which I write as the combination of two-way fixed effects, IM, IT, and MT, and then sort of a shifter. Now, the problem, of course, so there are two problems of running this regression as it is. The first problem is that we have measurement error at this, well, in general, in the estimating the production linkages, and estimating it via gravity. And the second problem is that we essentially, this component, the observed productivity shock, can be moving together with the revenues, right? So essentially this a better way of doing it is to instrument these changes via some IV, which is essentially a shock, like a conflict shock, which is essentially a combination of supplier and buyer exposures times the post, right? So the gravity is for the fixed effect, and this is sort of our IV, which is very similar to the reduced form, to the spirit of the reduced form exercise. And then I test if gamma is equals to 1, so which is essentially saying that if this sufficient statistic formula is true. Now, there are two parts of this analysis. So the first part, essentially, I estimate the alpha tilde, the A tilde and A tilde S and A tilde B, and I run an IV regression. And what I find is that the coefficient is not statistically different from 1. So gamma, we cannot reject gamma being 1. And then I can redo this with different types of fixed effects, including like sector year fixed effects and region year fixed effects. And this doesn't really change the finding. 3? Okay, good. Yeah, I think I'm gonna be on time. And then the second part is where I close down this link adjustment. So I essentially take the flows, the linkages as before the conflict. And then I re-estimate the A tildes, and then I run this IV regression again. So what do I find? So I do find that the coefficient is actually now much larger than 1, and it does become statistically different from 1. All right, on all of those specifications, which means that the variation that is generated by the model without link adjustment is smaller than the actual observed variation in the data, which means in turn, so gamma larger than 1 means in turn that the model without link adjustment underpredicts the sales reduction. So in this sense, there is an amplification mechanism. So if we ignore the link adjustment, we underpredict the drop in sales for the firms, and this link changes for the firms that are affected, it amplifies the effects of the conflict, this indirect effects of the conflict. Now, to follow up on that, so we did two things. We essentially we tested the model fit, and we sort of understood what's happening with the amplification. What about the aggregate effects now? So the way we do it is that we take tau, the iceberg cost, to infinity. So we essentially, or you can think about how we can close the overall trade with the conflict areas. And what we get is the welfare estimates. So then we can sort of calculate the aggregate welfare from the model. Now we're more confident that it's an accurate model. So with link adjustment, we get the number which at the mean welfare loss is minus 5.6%. All right. So this is the same order of magnitude of what is the overall GRP losses in Ukraine at that time outside the conflict area. Of course, there is some variation. Now, if we close down link adjustment again, we get a much larger change, right? So it's minus 8.4 instead of minus 5.6%. So the aggregate welfare loss is large, but it's mitigated by reorganization. So this is the case without reorganization, this is the case with reorganization. And then we can play around of shocking one region at a time instead of sort of shocking all of them together. So yeah, so this is the map of the negative welfare effects. So there are regions that are close by, like the rest of Luhansk Oblast is seriously affected. Oh, I think this might be actually, yeah, this is the rest of Lugansk Oblast and Kharkov region. But also Odessa is quite seriously affected. So this is just by the nature of trade links, but also there is some heterogeneity in terms of the sectors that are affected, right? So I can plot the welfare estimates vis-a-vis some variables, and the main variables that I care about is the distance to conflict areas. So there is a positive correlation. The closer you are, the closer you are, the more you are affected. But it's not one-to-one again, so there are some outliers. But the other variable that is important is that essentially the share of manufacturing sector. So the regions that are relatively far away, but they can have a higher share of manufacturing, they are also affected by this by the input component. All right, let me just sum up what I had. So first of all, I showed you the reduced form evidence on how supply chain disruption and reorganization is happening in Ukraine after 2014 Russian invasion. Then there are essentially two channels. One is the amplification of the firms for the firms that are affected, and then there's a mitigation of the aggregate welfare loss from the network readjustment. So this is essentially highlighting the key mechanism on how even a localized conflict can sort of spread out in the rest of the economy. And have a detrimental effects. All right, thank you.
Yeah, strictly one question.
Strictly one. Oh, I guess maybe
sorry.
I need this. Yeah, you can have this.
Yeah, I find this super fascinating work. Really.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, like, could you simulate the effect of riskiness? On like relinkages, so firms anticipate like that the conflict might spread and are already looking for new suppliers or new buyers before it's too late. I mean, maybe the first shock it's surprising, I understand, but then later maybe do you still see? And of course, this is more of a headache question, I guess, because it's like more of a spillover that you would capture with a time fixed effect in the reduced form and. Maybe I don't know about how the structure.
So it's a little bit in the spirit of Balboni and Böhm paper on Pakistan, where there's flooding and then firms they essentially they change their expectations. Maybe not enough. I need to think about it. So I think our current analysis is basically we control this out in a way, even in the model. But I think we need to take it maybe in a separate exercise a bit more seriously. Yeah. Thank you.